Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, so in the next section of the book, Nimzowitsch discusses a key game of his that played a huge part in his new philosophy of the center. He opens the section by commenting that sometimes, even when an attacker has played according to the instructions we have looked at, i.e. attacking the pawn chain at the base and using the exchanging maneuver on the blockading square and thus being rewarded with the complete liberation of his pawns that have been restricted, it occasionally still happens that the struggle on the board gets bogged down and it becomes necessary to employ a new strategy. His game was against Solway, and it featured exactly this phenomenon, and we'll have a look at that now. It was played in Carlsbad, a tournament for the great chess masters of the day, in 1911. Nimzowitsch had white, and he opened with e4. Solway answered with e6, the French defense, and after d4, d5, e5, see advanced variation, so we went into the main line. c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, adding more pressure to the base of white's chain, d4, and attempting to encourage white to give up his center with d takes c5. And after this, black has the attractive possibility of targeting the weakened e5 pawn, forcing it to exchange and then rolling down the center with his liberated pawns, every French defense player's dream. Nimzowitsch continued with bishop d3. He doesn't have to worry about d4 because he's got a tactical trick if black wins the pawn. So Solway continued with bishop d7, just countering the trick, which is if black had played c takes d4, c takes d4, knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, bishop b5, discover check, winning the queen. Simple trap that every French defense player knows. So bishop d7 stops that idea. So d takes c5 was the move now from Nimzowitsch, which is quite remarkable because it's against general principles, but Nimzowitsch of course had positional ideas in mind. After bishop takes c5 he castled, and after f6 he played b4, which is another move that I would consider unorthodox because it creates this very weak c-pawn on an open file. The idea, in Nimzowicz's words, is to offer lasting protection to e5. Other moves, such as queen e2, would have also done this, but the protection would have not been as solid. For example, if queen e2, f takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, knight f6, and it's easy for black to break down this blockade on the e5 square. So this is not the strongest way to play, and indeed black already has an edge in this position. So b4, bishop e7, and now bishop f4, further emphasizing the blockades. So now, after black plays f takes e5, he will have a very difficult time breaking down the blockade. After knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, knight f6, because bishop takes g7 was a threat, and just simply to finish development and castle. It's important to note he can't play bishop f6 here because of queen h5 check, and he loses castling rights. G6 is wrong, bishop takes g6, h takes g6, queen takes g6, check is best, king e7, bishop takes f6 check, knight takes f6, and queen g7 checks, winning back the piece and finishing up 2 pawns to the good. So it's obviously just not an option for black. So knight f6, and now we have the position we looked at a few examples ago. So knight d2. Nimzowitsch of course plays the correct positional move instead of queen c2. So castles, and now knight f3 to reinforce the blockading troops. So bishop d6, and now queen e2. And as we saw before, play now continued with rook ac8, bishop d4, queen c7, knight e5. And it becomes clear that the immobility of black's central pawns is greater than ever. White has achieved this with very economical play. However, it should be noted that the possibility of setting up such a strong blockade, not only on e5 but also on d4, hung by a thread and depended entirely on the correct exploitation of available squares and the correct placement of pieces. So, what can black do now? He is forced into playing longer-winded maneuvers, for one thing. Salway now played bishop e8. So, rook ae1. It's further emphasizing the e file, the e5 square, the e6 pawn, and notably the blockade. And now came the somewhat controversial bishop takes e5. So bishop takes e5, queen c6, and now a nice move from Nimzowitsch. Bishop d4, attacking the e6 square and backward pawn, and forces the light square bishop to decide on a square. So Salway played bishop d7, and now came queen c2, which is now fine to play, with the same idea of taking on f6 and then winning h7. And the reason it's okay now is because white doesn't have to sacrifice his positional grip in order to win the pawn. He still have control of e5, which is the important thing here. So rook f7 to defend h7. He's intending g takes f6 presumably. So rook e3 and b6. Black is forced into passivity. Rook g3, and now the threat is bishop takes f6, and there can't be g takes f6, so it would have to be rook takes, and then the h pawn is falling. So king h8 in order to deal with that threat, but this misses a nice trick from white. If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Of course, it's no good to have positional skill on its own. You have to be able to utilize tactics as well. Bishop takes h7 is possible here, with the idea of queen g6 if knight takes h7. So Salway played instead e5. We can have a quick look at knight takes h7, queen g6. This attacks the rook and also threatens simply rook h3 and mate to follow. For example, if rook cf8, rook h3, and forced mate. So this threat is so strong that black would have to lose the f7 rook, after which he's just exchanged down and simply lost. So e5 is what Salway played. Now bishop g6 to save the bishop. So rook e7, now rook e1, pinning the pawn and protecting the bishop, tactically. So queen t6, now bishop e3, d4, bishop g5, rook takes c3, rook takes c3, d takes c3, queen takes c3, and white now has a very big edge. He's a pawn up along with the bishop pair, and as a result won very quickly. We can just go through the rest of the game quickly. It's just a crushing advantage for white. Now h4. It's just going to be overwhelming. White's only a pawn up, but it's just 3-1 majority, and the blockade here. It's going to be completely winning. So Salway resigned at this point. So it's very simple and effective chess from Nimzowitsch. And the reason Salway's plan of attacking the white center pawns in order to liberate his own pawns and march them down the board failed. And the reason why is because Nimzowitsch was able to set up such a strong blockade, and as a result Salway was forced into suboptimal play. And from this game it should be clear that restraining our opponent's pawns with pieces is just as effective as restraining them with pawns. As a result of that, it will always do us well to bear in mind that we may not be able to advance our apparently liberated pawns once we have taken pains to destroy our opponent's center. In fact, it is far more important to consider how strong a blockade can be set up to restrain the pawns in question, whether they be ours or our opponents. Okay. So the next section is entitled The Positional Struggle, or simply put, the slow siege of the unprotected base. Nimzowitsch again looks at the same line of the French to illustrate his point. e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, bishop d3. And now, instead of bishop d7, which we saw in the last game, an improvement with c takes d4, because after c takes d4, the base of the pawn chain is totally immobile and can never be supported by a pawn if black doesn't want to allow it, with an exchange on c3, and therefore black's strategy for the game will be clear. Before he captured on d4, white always had the option of d takes c5, but of course this is no longer possible. Now that black is able to pressurize d4, he can tie the white pieces up a little, which is the most important factor, rather than actually winning the pawn. As a result, some of the white pieces will be forced to defensive and therefore passive roles, and black achieves the advantage of aggressively posted pieces. Next might come bishop d7, and now bishop e2, because knight d2 runs into knight b4. Sorry, instead of bishop e2, bishop c2 would run into knight b4, and black is winning the bishop pair. So knight g e7, and black is aiming to add more pressure immediately to d4, and this is correct because in closed games, i.e. games characterized by pawn chains, the guiding principle is the pawn chain itself and of course its base on d4. So white must try and defend it. So b3, knight f5, bishop b2, but now black has bishop b4 check, and white has to give up castling rights with king f1. If he plays instead knight bd2 or knight c3, the black strategy has worked because of the white pieces defending d4, getting in each other's way. So simply knight c takes d4 is possible now, and you know, a great and probably close to winning game for black already. So king f1, and now bishop e7, and it would point that g4, if white plays it to try and get rid of this pressure, can be answered with knight h4. And there's an important principle at work here. In order to maintain the pressure, black must not allow white to disturb the ratio of 3-3 with attackers and defenders on d4. He could also play h5 to enable this, i.e. to stop white from playing g4. But let's say he plays bishop e7 instead. So g4 can now be met with knight h4, as I said, and the point of bishop e7 is clear. So now the equal ratio of attackers to defenders will remain in place, with each side having lost one. So it becomes 2 attackers to 2 defenders if knight takes h4 and bishop takes h4. And of course, if bishop e7 hadn't been played, black would have to retreat the knight, and the pressure on d4 would be significantly reduced as a result. The typical strategy for positions such as this is as follows. Firstly, the opposing pawn base is base pawn is fixed on its square and attacked by several pieces. At the minimum, this requires aggressive piece posting. An indicator that this is becoming effective is that your opponent starts to have problems with development. A side effect of this is that should you suddenly decide to start attacking elsewhere, your attacking pieces should be able to attack more vigorously than your opponent can defend, because of the fact that his pieces are already somewhat tied down. Secondly, you should maintain the pressure on the base for as long as possible, or at least until new weaknesses have arisen as a result of the pressure. In the instance on the board here, black can aim for later play on the f-file and, you know, the weakened white king side. If such an opportunity arises, then the attack on the original weak pawn should be set aside and the new weakness attacked as energetically as possible. The original weak pawn is not going anywhere. If it is one such as the pawn here on d4, and you can, you know, just return to it later in the endgame if the new weakness doesn't prove to be decisive in your opponent's camp. Specifically, you know, in the end game, this can be a significant weakness and lose the game very quickly if white isn't careful. Thirdly, the attacker must also bear in mind that he has a base pawn to defend as well. On e6 here. Although, you know, black is quicker to attack here, he must bear in mind that if white sets up a satisfactory defense, the possibility of f4, f5 remains in order to attack e6 and the black king side in general, which is cramped by the pawn on e5. So we can look at a couple more examples to illustrate these ideas. Here the pawn chain in question is the e4, d5 pawns for white and the e5, d6 pawns for black. The d6 pawn is the base of the chain. We can see an example of fixing the base and then attacking it with pieces as follows. C takes d6, c takes d6, and now rook c6, immediately attacking d6. Black will have to defend with both pieces anyway, so now he can play knight f7, and after knight c4, rook d8. If instead rook c8, b5, and if rook takes c6, d takes c6, with a promising endgame for white. So rook d8, and now a4. The point of this move is to stop black from playing b5, kicking the knight and relieving the pressure on d6. So from this position, white has the d6 pawn under pressure, and you know, a nice edge in the endgame. He has achieved the ideal mentioned before of more aggressively posted pieces. Both his knight and his rook are better than their counterparts in the black position. White can follow up with several different ideas. For example, b5, king c3, and a5, or he can play on the king side with h4 and bring in the king to h5 and then playing g4, g5, and you know, black can't stop this by playing h6, or the white king is going to enter through g6 and destroy the black king side, and you know, which obviously would be critical. The ideas behind the pressure on d6 and possible ways to continue here are fairly simple. What's harder to judge is how long to maintain the pressure, when to relinquish it, whether weaknesses created as a result of it are exploitable, and whether a new plan should be created to follow up the current one of maintaining pressure. In any case, we can certainly keep our opponent suffering for an extended period merely because he is forced into a defensive state, and almost invariably this will result in a further weakening, which we can then exploit as energetically as possible. Additionally, Nimzowitsch notes, the further apart the two weaknesses are, the better for the side on the offensive. Moreover, he goes on to emphasize that in the endgame, the goal is a direct and very real seizure of the object of attack, i.e. the base pawn of the chain. However, in the middle game, such attacks normally just help to create other indirect advantages. We have seen this same phenomenon in the examples we looked at previously. Black attacks the base of the white pawn chain as vigorously as possible, and as a result the defenders get in each other's way, difficulties in development arise, and white creates a new weakness. This is the indirect fruit of black's play. He can now forget about the base pawn and focus instead on the new weakness with all his energy. Then later in the endgame we can return to the weak base pawn if we like. For example, let's look at the following game. e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, and you know, the same line of the French we looked at already. And bishop b4 check, and as we saw before, white must now give up castling rights with king f1. And what this also means is that the pressure on d4 has a solid consequence. In the previous example, black played to maintain this pressure with moves like h5 or bishop e7, but Nimzowitsch suggested instead aiming to exploit immediately the weakness of white having lost castling rights, and the fact that the king is on f1. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the most effective way of doing that? If you want to try and figure it out, then stop the video now. Simply castling was the move that Nimzowitsch himself suggested. His idea is that after g4 comes knight h6, attacking the g-pawn, rook g1, now f6, e takes f6, rook takes f6, allowing g5, because now comes rook takes f3, and bishop takes f3. If g takes h6, rook f7, black is fine. So bishop takes f3, and now knight f5, renewing the pressure on d4, and white has to play rook g4 if he wants to hold it. So from this position, Nimzowitsch felt that white's completely bare kingside and the weakly protected squares on the f-file should not only be enough compensation for the exchange, but enough to win the game outright. Play might continue bishop e8, or even rook f8 is also good enough. So bishop e8, sorry. Queen e2, knight c takes d4, rook takes d4. This is best for white, because after knight takes d4 he can play queen e5, threatening to win the knight. Black can play bishop b5 check, and after king g2, knight f5. He has to keep an eye on g7 as well. So now bishop takes d5 is possible, because the knight will be hanging afterwards. And the same is to remove the defender. If instead knight c3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, d4, and black is doing very well here. So bishop takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes f5, rook f8, queen takes d5 check, rook f7. Black allows this pin in order to protect g7, and from this position black is simply winning. Bishop c6 is threatened, and white is still undeveloped. Play might continue queen d4, bishop c5, and you know, just a crushing advantage for black already here. So in this example we see how the weakening move provoked by having to passively defend was possible to exploit directly. Immediately after king f1, black's focus switched from the pawn that was on d4 to the white king side. Another thing we must consider is the notion of transferring the focus of attack. As we've seen in many of the previous examples, black had to choose between the options of bishop d7 and c takes d4. Nimzowitsch stresses that often the moment will come in such situations that a decision must be made regarding which plan to follow, because it's not possible to retain the possibility of either plan indefinitely. When it comes to pawn chains, at least, a moment will arrive when our opponent will be able to break free from the uncertainty we have placed him in before electing a plan, and of course we must decide what to do before that moment comes. Also, our opponent may threaten us on the opposite flank, which again means that we must take action regarding the decision to be made. Moreover, it is often not easy to decide where exactly we should be attacking. In the examples we looked at, it was always the d4 pawn, and Nimzowitsch has advised us that we should always be attacking the base of the pawn chain. But what happens when that base proves itself to be unattainable? Should we then create a new base to attack? Nimzowitsch felt that we should, and he gave the following example. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop e7, d4, d6, d5. Now knight b8, and having knocked black back, white can continue with bishop d3 and c4, c5 to create a weak black pawn to attack. And black, on the other hand, will aim to play f5 in order to attack the e4 pawn. And the ideas within the play can be crystallized into the following position. Here, simplified, but the ideas are the same. And from here, you know, black's attack on e4 does not look so promising after f takes e4, f takes e4, because the e4 pawn is well defended and difficult to attack. Similarly, white has a pleasant position after knight takes e4 and also bishop takes e4, you know, with a satisfactory center in all cases. So instead of allowing these options, black should not take on e4 in the initial position, but he should play instead f4. And after something like b4, he should play g5. And this is the point of black's plan, to attack the new base, which is the pawn on f3, because f4 has been played. And, you know, white can still defend f3 well enough. Black won't be winning it anytime soon or anything like that, but the point is that the position of the white king will become threatened and cramped in the resulting positions. So for this reason, you know, the position of the white king, f3 is a weaker base than e4, and you know, that's the logic behind transferring the attack to that square and that pawn. Other events can also take place that render a given base weaker than another and thus motivate us to focus our attack there. We must consider all of the above factors when deciding where to attack in our games. We can have a look at an example of this that Nimzowitsch provides. So e4, knight c6, d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, f4, e6, kind of offbeat opening. Knight f3, knight b4, try and take on c2, bishop b5, check c6, bishop a4, b5, a3. Knight a6, now bishop b3, c5, c3. As I said, it's kind of an unorthodox opening, but it gets us to the key position that we want to talk about. So what is the correct move here for black, given what we've looked at? If you want to take some time to consider it, then stop the video now. And this is an interesting case because it's a situation where we have to judge the correct way to play for black and what we should be trying to do. And you know, in many of these lines we've been attacking d4, but in this instance, given the piece placement and everything, in particular this knight on a6, it should be clear that d4 is amply protected for white, as well as difficult to defend for black. Difficult to attack. And therefore it doesn't make any sense for black to focus his attack on d4. Instead he should play c4 and focus instead on the c3 pawn, as follows: bishop c2, bishop takes c2, queen takes c2, knight e7. You can follow up with h5 and f5, although weakening, to restrain white on the king side, and then he can retreat a6, knight is like c7, and play a5 and b4. And Nimzowitsch closes this chapter by emphasizing how difficult it is to understand and play correctly against pawn chains, as there are so many factors to consider, such as to attack on the flank or at the base of a chain, as well as choosing to do so by surprise attack or through a prolonged siege, i.e. whether the base is fixed or not, and whether to advance the attack to the next member of the chain, as well as how carefully we must defend our own base. He also says that this was a difficult chapter, but one that should have been illuminating to those who understood it well. The concepts are ones that rose organically from Nimzowicz's rules about open files and playing against blockaders. We will explore further ideas concerning the pawn chain in the second section of the book. So we can have a look at a sample game to finish off the chapter and the first section of the book. This was played by Poulsen against Tarrasch in 1888. Poulsen had white and opened with e4, after which came the opening that we've looked at a lot in this chapter. Yeah, and the same lines we've seen before. Bishop b4 check, king f1, bishop e7. Like, I can only assume that this variation of the French was a main line at the time. Nowadays it's nowhere near as popular. And we know obviously the reasons behind black's play so far and white's play. And g3 is what Paulsen chose at this stage in order to castle artificially. And Tarrasch now played the questionable a5 to try and attack b3, but Nimzowitsch felt this was wrong. And, you know, as we've seen, he should be focusing instead on the weakened position of the white king. Play continued a4, rook c8, bishop b5, and this is one of the problems of having played a5. The b5 square is now a great support point for the white pieces. So knight b4, and now bishop takes d7 check, another inaccuracy in Nimzowicz's view. He felt that knight c3 was the correct move here, although Paulsen's choice means that black also cannot castle after king takes d7. So knight c3, knight c6, knight b5, knight a7, and now another strange move, knight takes a7, because white should not surrender his strong point on b5. Better was queen d3, allowing knight takes b5, a takes b5, with a dynamic compensation with the doubled pawns. So knight takes a7, queen takes a7, and now queen d3. And here Tarrasch played a very nice move, queen a6, accepting the double pawns for good compensation, which will be clear, and the direct attacking idea of concentrating on the weak base d4 in an endgame, where it can be proved to be the most weak in comparison to all other areas of the game. So next came queen takes a6, b takes a6, king g2, rook c2, attacking the bishop. So bishop c1, now rook b8, attacking b3. So rook b1, now rook c3, attacking b3 a second time. So bishop d2, so that after rook takes b3, rook takes b3, rook takes b3, white has bishop takes a5. But this relieves black of his weak doubled pawns, despite retaining material equality, and leaves white with a hard game because he has to defend not only d4 but also a4. So next came rook b2, and not rook a3 because of rook c1, and some problems for black. So rook b2 and bishop d2. If rook c1 now, knight e3 check, exploits the pin. It's completely dominating after king g1 and knight c4. So bishop d2, and now bishop b4, bishop f4, now h6 to stop knight g5, although it allows white to attack on the king side, but black has more than enough play on the king side to compensate in. So g4, knight e7, rook a1, knight c6, bishop c1, rook c2, bishop a3, rook c4. Black could have just played bishop takes a3 there, would very promising endgame. So bishop b3, now bishop c3, bishop takes, rook b1, now king c7, stop any rook penetration. g5, rook c4. Finally, black achieves the ideal square for his rook, attacking both weak pawns and with it a huge endgame advantage. So g takes h6, g takes h6, a5, now rook a4, and not knight takes d4, or white has knight d4, rook b6 with counterplay. So rook a4, now king g3, going after the h6 pawn, a desperate bid to create some play, but white is just dead lost here. Play continued with rook takes a5, king g4, rook a3, rook d1, rook b3, h4, knight e7, knight e1, knight f5, knight d3, a5, knight c5. There's not much need to go into any great depth of understanding here, because we're just looking at principles as to what exactly is going on with the game. White is getting some activity here, but nothing that's going to save the game. So takes, and now rook a8, and black went on to win, sorry, without much difficulty. So it was a nice endgame from Tarrasch, which brings this chapter and this section of the book to a close. So that is the simple stuff covered, i.e. the elements that make up the more complicated ideas concerning positional play, which are covered in the remaining section of the book, part 2. I'm going to take a short break now because Anand Carlsen is pending and I want to give that my full attention. So we'll return to Nimzowitsch and my system after that match has taken place. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter and this first half of the book. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.